Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Paul King's film Wonka. This is the 2023 prequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, either the Gene Wilder or the Johnny Depp versions, though there are some substantive differences. And I would say the aesthetics of this are drawn somewhat more from the 1970s version with Gene Wilder than from the 2010s, I think, version with Johnny Depp. But this is a prequel film about how Willy Wonka comes to establish his chocolate business. It's also a really interesting commentary on the nature of capitalism, because we have sort of three models of capitalism at work in the film, two of which are bad, one of which we're meant to be rooting for. So, Willy Wonka, at the beginning of the film, gets off a ship. Apparently he has been a sailor. He gets off a ship in Paris. I know that Paris was a port city. It's on a river, but the implication is that Willy Wonka has been at sea. Anyway, doesn't really matter, not that important. He goes to Paris because Paris is where the best chocolatiers in the world are. The Dutch and the Belgians might have something to say about that, but whatever. And basically his dream is to open a magical chocolate shop, right? One of the problems he runs into is that he's poor. And so he's offered a very cheap room for the night by a guy named Abacus Crunch. By Bleacher. Sorry. Abacus Crunch is a different guy. Sorry. Anyway, so Bleacher basically offers him this very cheap room in the boarding house of Mrs. Scrubbit. This is the first model of capitalism that we get in the film. They offer a very cheap room, but Willy Wonka, who is illiterate, is not able to read the fine print, which he's warned to do by Noodle, an orphan who lives in Mrs. Scrubbit's boarding house. And so he doesn't realize that there are a ton of additional fees tacked on for everything. So the glass of gin that he is offered when he comes in, he has to pay for it. That's somewhat not that unexpected. But he has to pay to use the stairs to get up to the room and down from the room. He has to pay to use the pillow. He has to pay to use the sheets. He has to pay to use the blanket. He has to pay to walk on the floor. He has to pay for all these things. And so he ends up owing a ton of money. 10,000 gold sovereigns, which is substantially more than he has, which is no gold sovereigns. And so this is a grift, basically. This is a scheme in which they massively overcharge people for a ton of stuff, and then basically enslave them in the laundry cleaning business that Mrs. Scrubbit and Bleacher run. So Willy is put to work in this laundry business. This is one model of sort of Gilded Age style capitalism, in which you basically create debt that people can never actually hope to pay off, and then require them to work for you in order to pay down that debt. But as they continue paying it down, they also incur further expenses because everything that they need to do in order to live involves expenses. We see this model, for instance, in the coal towns of West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, these areas. The Appalachian region in the early 1900s, late 1800s, where company towns were the norm, this was a very common thing. You would go into debt in order to live, and then in order to try and pay off the debt, you had to work for the company. This is meant to be a bad model of capitalism in the film. We are supposed to be critical of this, and that's fair enough. It is a bad approach. Debt slavery is not a good system. Hashtag woke. So we have that element. On the other hand, we have a more far-reaching model of capitalism, which is basically embodied by Slugworth, Prodnose, and Fickelgruber, the three people who dominate the chocolate market in Paris at this time, or in this film. They weren't real people. So we have these three guys, and basically they run a very, again, industrial era capitalist style of business. They've effectively created a tripartite monopoly. That is, the three of them control the distribution of chocolate, and they do this partially by forcing smaller competitors like Willy Wonka out by undercutting prices. They are corrupt, so they bribe the chief of police, who doesn't actually have a character name, as far as I can tell. They bribe the chief of police with chocolate, large amounts of chocolate, to first hassle Willy Wonka and then basically get him sort of sent out of town and killed. They have Father Julius, who's a sort of bishop or something along those lines. He's sort of upper-ranking clergy. He is bribed with chocolate by this chocolate cartel. And basically, in exchange, he lets them sort of use under the cathedral as their secret headquarters. So there is this corruption, there's this power being used, and all of this stuff. And because it is directed at Willy Wonka specifically, and he is our hero, we're meant to see this as a bad thing, right? This is a bad model of capitalism, where it is run monopolistically, price gouging occurs, corruption occurs, bribery occurs, and the sort of small guy with a dream isn't able to break into the market, etc., etc. Now, this, of course, is the reality of capitalism, and this is one of the things that the film, I think, is ambiguous about. Because this is how capitalism works, especially in countries like the US, my country, but in many other countries in sort of Europe, in the West, and probably in the global South as well, although there, I think, there's often sort of different situations, but whatever. There are a lot of companies that have a monopolistic control over their particular industry. You think about, for instance, internet providers. In the US, there are a fairly small number of internet providers, and wherever you live, you likely live in the territory of one of these major internet providers. And they have agreed, and we know this, this is historically documented, they have agreed to keep prices within certain ranges and to provide certain quality of service, while making it very, very difficult for any competitors to enter the market. We also, in the US especially, have lobbying. We have tons and tons and tons of lobbying. Part of the reason why we have so few gun restrictions, even though gun restrictions are incredibly popular with the American people, is because the gun lobby spends a ton of money to ensure that we don't get those regulations passed. Again, this is the reality of capitalism. What Slugworth, Prodnose, and Fickelgruber do, that's how the game is played. And interestingly enough, we are supposed to root against them, which might be read as a critique of capitalism, right? It might be read as this film critiquing the capitalist system. The system is bad. because it has these features, which are features and not bugs, as the common saying goes. But the film is actually not entirely critical of capitalism. And I would actually argue that in a way it is uncritical of capitalism, because what it does is it actually embraces the ideological fantasy of capitalism. So what I mean by ideological fantasy is this is the sort of image of a thing as it ideally might function. It is an idealization. It is, if capitalism did not have all of the problems that capitalism had, here is how it would be good. And that model, that ideological fantasy of capitalism is embodied in Willy Wonka, because he comes literally from nothing. Like, he gets off the ship and he has a dozen gold sovereigns, which seems like, I don't know how much a gold sovereign was in early 1900s, whenever this is set, but that seems like quite a bit of money for a regular sailor to have. Maybe not, but anyway. But he quickly loses all of them in one way or another through a combination of generosity, carelessness, etc., etc. So he ends up with nothing, no money, zero cash, and he works his way up over the course of the movie, right? He becomes successful. This is the bootstraps narrative, pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps. And of course, this is part of the ideological fantasy of capitalism, that if you just work hard enough, if you're dedicated, honest, and you have a good idea, good product, whatever it is, you will be successful. In reality, this does not really work. You can become comfortable with a small business or something like that, but almost no one who has large amounts of money has earned it. And that's a contentious statement. Almost everybody who is ultra wealthy today started out reasonably wealthy. They started out pretty wealthy. The kinds of people whose parents could give them a couple $1 million to start a business or two, which is not most people. So there's the bootstraps narrative. And there's also the Wonka model of capitalism, the Wonka model of business, which is, this is not a business about profit. The goal is not to make money, which is the goal for Slugworth, Prodnose, and Fickelgruber. The goal is to spread joy and magic and to have people just be happy with their chocolate. And that isn't what capitalism is about. That's what capitalism is about in the fantasy of defenders of capitalism. People who are like, yes, this is how it should ideally work. They don't say ideally, but they say this is how it should work. Is that it should be about providing the best service at the best price, etc., etc. It doesn't work that way. It isn't that way. And we know that intuitively as people who live in capitalist societies. I live in a capitalist society. I'm assuming you, the viewer of this, do as well. We know that, right? How many successful businesses sell a crappy product at an exorbitant rate? They don't go out of business. Record-breaking corporate profits are occurring right now as prices go up, even though inflation has actually gone down. We know that this doesn't work. We intuitively know this through experience. And so this is part of the thing, right? This is part of what makes this an ideological fantasy, because the reality does not align with what is sort of imagined to be the best possible system. And what the business that Wonka and his friends build is based on that best possible system, right? It's built on this idea of our primary goal is to bring people joy, to share chocolate, to share magic that the customer experience comes first, and profit is not the driving motive. Again, that's the fantasy of capitalism, but it bears little resemblance to the reality. But we're supposed to root for the ideological fantasy. We're supposed to root for the idea that capitalism can be positive and it can be built on joy, sharing, building, selling the best product for the best price, etc., etc. And we have to ignore the fact that the reality of capitalism, when we support capitalism, hoping for the ideological fantasy of Wonka, what we get is the reality of Slugworth, Fickelgruber, and Prodnose.